really nail down this sort of that tendency to use global generic language rather than specific language. I don't think we've got that nailed down yet, but if you could nail down where that cutoff is, that would have some promise. And psycholinguistics people have been looking at this for a while. You know, one of the things that certainly characterizes the speech of people as they get into middle stages of dementia is a lot of reliance on pronouns without ever specifying what the pronoun refers to. So you say, you know, she and he and they, and you've never said a name, so the person you're talking to has no idea who she or he is. Or, as Martha talks about in the paper for today, you know, kind of you show somebody a picture of something and they can't say Boston Terrier, but they might be able to say dog. Or worse, they might not be able to say dog, but they can say animal. And so you're going to higher levels of abstraction. You're still in the ballpark in the semantic network, but you can't have the specificity.
I read a newspaper article that someone in England was trying to link herpes and Alzheimer's.
Herpes?
Yeah.
In particular kind?
I can't remember the name of it, but it's the kind that 80% of the population has, like the regular.
It's a good base rate.
Yeah.
Hopefully lots of people with Alzheimer's.
I tried to look up the journal, but
yeah, when we get a little bit more into the colleges, I read in the Tuck on campus, and he's on the trail of another interesting aspect. Just earlier this week. So normal aging, dementia. Well, the other thing Martha mentions that I thought was really intriguing was the idea that pretty early on in dementia, in Alzheimer's disease type dementia, people lose fear conditioning. And that makes some anatomical sense because the amygdala and the hippocampus are right next to each other in the brain, and the amygdala would be involved in fear conditioning. And if you could, something along those lines would have promise. But at this point, what we know in terms of normal aging and dementia is that people with dementia eventually get worse enough that there's no doubt. But in the early phases, there's lots of doubt, and probably can't tell until a while, or at least we can't tell with repeated testing, without repeated testing over some period of time. And imaging and stuff like that at this point in time doesn't really help, because imaging doesn't give you a really clear result until you can tell in a clinical interview. Now, mild cognitive impairment lies in between the two. Actually, before I get there, I want to insert one other. Should have cognitive impairment as a general idea here before we get to mild cognitive impairment. As we use it in aging research, cognitive impairment, just those words themselves without the mild, usually refers to a bad score on a mental status exam. The most common being the mini mental status, which we'll give you as a class a little later on in session today. It's kind of a pop quiz. I'll find out if anybody has dementia. If as a group you have dementia. Cognitive impairment, and in some epidemiological, demographic kind of studies, you even have parts of a mini mental status exam or some other set of cognitive tests, and then a poor response on those is interpreted as having cognitive impairment. But the term cognitive impairment in and of itself just means that you have that low score. And you could have that low score because you've never been, for lack of a better phrase, any brighter than that. And for example, I mean, if you're developmentally disabled and you live in the late life, you're going to be cognitively impaired in this sense. If you have low education levels, the general cutoff on large-scale research would seem to be like 8 years of education and less tends to be where most of the mental status exams start to cause trouble. You may very well show
57.
3 o'clock. You'll very likely show up as cognitively impaired on this kind of test. Language issues could be showing up as cognitively impaired. Certainly people who are illiterate tend to show up and use them as cognitively impaired in math and so forth. So the key point that I keep in mind is cognitive impairment in and of itself doesn't necessarily show a decline from the previous state. To actually have a diagnosis of dementia, you have to be worse than you used to be. So if you've never had it, it's not a sign of dementia.
So getting back to what you said about language and maybe English is a language, a lot of times when people retire, they might not, their English might become worse because they're surrounded by people from their own culture. Like I know my mom, when she retired, her English skills went way down. She only speaks Farsi with her friends and at home.
I had a client who lost a lot of her English. She moved back to Chicago and lived in a Polish neighborhood for a couple of years and then moved back to California. Actually, eventually it turned out that some of it was dementia. It took me an embarrassingly long time to admit that she had dementia. But it wasn't right at that point. I think that she had gotten it. Yeah, I think, people, because of the problems that we have in testing people in other languages, at kind of a healthcare systems level, we tend to be way more ready than makes any sense to test people in English who probably shouldn't be tested in English. And I think you always want to be a little bit concerned about testing somebody in English, even if they're English fluent now, if English was not their first primary language. It might work, it might not. That's certainly the case like you're describing with your mother. If you've got somebody who used to be fluent and obviously hasn't been practicing it for a long time, you wouldn't want to make a judgment about dementia on your mother based on her being tested in English. And it wouldn't be really easy to get her tested in Farsi. Might not be impossible, but it wouldn't be easy.
Can you distinguish between what we've been studying about, just like the age-related cognitive declines versus when it hits mild cognitive impairment?
We'll try that next year.
Thanks.
It's not going to get real good.
I hope.
So again, I've seen lots of professional writing in the field and advocacy statements that go directly from population study estimates of cognitive impairment established based on like the mini mental status exam to prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. Doesn't work for all the reasons I just said. Mild cognitive impairment has a kind of interesting history because the first stab of this, and this controversy continued for quite a while, and to some extent continues, although I think the MCI people have kind of largely won at this point. And Martha talks about some of the studies in the article assigned for today. Originally, this was framed as kind of age-associated memory impairment, and the idea if you want to take a fairly benign view of the motives, and then I'll give you a more cynical view next. If you want to take a more benign view of the motives, the idea was, well, maybe some people with higher end normal aging decline in cognition, but not that is clearly not at the level of dementia, and so far shows